Joe Biden left us with.
I'm not asking about Joe Biden. I'm asking you a specific question. If your department deports anyone with an ongoing asylum application, you are violating the law. Is that correct?
It was greatly violated when they allowed.
I'm asking you.
People to come
I'm asking you.
Asylum applications.
Why are you filibustering? Why can't you answer the question? It's a simple question.
Your president,
if your department deports anyone with an ongoing asylum application, you are violating the law. Isn't that correct?
The asylum program was broken under the last.
Mr. Chairman, I will reclaim my time. She's not answering the question. But the obvious answer is that, yes, if you follow a lawful pathway, asylum is a lawful pathway. If you have an open asylum case, you are here lawfully. But the problem that we are seeing around the country.
What you're watching right here is what the collapse of the rule of law looks like in real time. And let me tell you, this is precisely the moment we've been warning about for years. Because when an executive official summoned before Congress refuses to answer a simple yes or no question about whether deporting people with active asylum applications violates federal statute, you are witnessing not mere evasion, but the deliberate dismantling of constitutional accountability. And if your heart isn't pounding right now, if you aren't feeling that sick rising dread in your stomach, then you haven't grasped the magnitude of what Representative Goldman just exposed in this exchange. Noem made the decision to allow migrants to continue to be transferred to El Salvador, and provided little information about the affair to the court in a sworn statement. And now here she is in front of Congress, employing the exact same obfuscation tactics that authoritarians have used throughout history when confronted with their violations of law, the deflection to previous administrations, the refusal to engage with the substance of direct questions, the filibustering designed to run out the clock on democratic oversight. But here's what makes this moment absolutely explosive, and you need to understand the broader context that makes Goldman's interrogation not just significant, but historically urgent, because Noem was the Trump administration official behind the decision not to comply with a federal judge's order to halt the deportation of alleged Venezuelan gang members to El Salvador under the Alien Enemies Act, and a whistleblower alleged that a top DOJ official told his colleagues in March that the administration intended to ignore court orders as part of Trump's aggressive deportation effort. Let that sink in for just a moment, because we're not talking about policy disagreements or interpretive questions about regulatory authority. We are talking about the Secretary of Homeland Security, allegedly making a conscious decision to defy a federal judge's explicit order, and then when a federal judge found probable cause exists to find the government in criminal contempt, the entire apparatus of executive power mobilized to stonewall the investigation. And now we see that same official before Congress refusing to acknowledge the most basic principle of asylum law. And you want to know what's even more chilling? What should keep every single person who cares about justice awake at night is that this isn't happening in isolation. This is part of a systematic campaign to demolish the entire architecture of due process for immigrants in this country, because IC and DHS officers have been detaining non-violent, non-criminal immigrants immediately following mandatory court appearances in many cases, even while their case remains active and viable. And Homeland Security lawyers note on a spreadsheet which cases are amenable to dismissal, allowing an asylum seeker to be immediately rearrested and placed in expedited removal proceedings. They are literally turning courthouses into traps, where people who followed the law, who showed up for their hearings, who are pursuing the lawful pathway that asylum represents, are being ambushed by masked federal agents and thrown into a deportation pipeline that strips them of every protection our legal system supposedly guarantees. Representative Goldman understands this, which is why he kept hammering away at that simple question, because the answer is unambiguous under United States law. If you deport someone with an active asylum application, you are violating federal statute, full stop. There is no wiggle room. There is no interpretive gray zone. Goldman introduced the Immigration Court Due Process Protection Act, new legislation that aims to protect immigrants who are pursuing lawful pathways to migrate to the United States and attending their court-ordered appearances from being targeted for arrests by the Trump administration, because he sees what's happening. He sees that we have crossed over from aggressive enforcement into the territory of lawless persecution, and the fact that Noem couldn't just say yes that deporting people with pending asylum cases is illegal tells you everything you need to know about the contempt this administration has for congressional oversight, for judicial authority, for the very concept of law itself. Now let's talk about what asylum actually means, because this isn't some loophole or some trick that people are exploiting. This is a bedrock principle of international and domestic law that emerged from the ashes of World War II, when the civilized world looked at what happened to refugees who were turned away from safe harbor and said never again. Under U.S. law, people who are seeking protection from violence or persecution in their home country can claim asylum to remain in the United States. And when you file an asylum application, when you're going through that process, you are here lawfully. That's not my opinion, that's not progressive, wishful thinking, that is black-letter law. And what Goldman was trying to get Noem to admit is that her department has been systematically violating that law, deporting people who have every legal right to be here while their cases are adjudicated. And here's where it gets even more insidious, because Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said the agency would pause processing all asylum applications indefinitely while it works through a 1 million-case backlog. The Trump administration has threatened to expand the travel ban list, paused all asylum decisions, and signaled it will reopen cases from the Biden administration, which means they're not just deporting people with pending cases, they're making sure those cases can never move forward. They're freezing the entire system in place so that people who entered legally, who did everything right, who are waiting for their day in court, will remain in this state of legal limbo until the administration can find a pretext to deport them anyway. This is the systematic destruction of asylum as a legal concept in the United States, and it's happening right before our eyes, and half the country either doesn't know or doesn't care, because the dehumanization has been so effective that when people hear asylum seeker, they don't think human being fleeing persecution, they think illegal alien invader criminal. But let me tell you about the people we're actually talking about here, because migrants said they had only recently crossed the U.S.-Mexico border when they were detained, and that they were hoping to seek asylum, but American authorities refused to hear their pleas and then treated them like criminals, putting them in shackles, loading them onto military airplanes. Detainees and their families have rejected government claims that they are gang members and decried the use of the Alien Enemies Act to circumvent the ordinary asylum process. These are human beings with names, with families, with stories of violence and terror that drove them from their homes, and the Trump administration invoked an 18th-century wartime statute designed to detain enemy aliens during declared wars, to bypass every single protection that Congress enacted to ensure people aren't sent back to face torture and death. And you know what Noem said about those people, the ones who ended up in CICOT, the mega prison in El Salvador, where she said they should stay there for the rest of their lives, even though many of them had viable asylum claims, even though the expedited process denied asylum rights, statutory protections under the Convention Against Torture, and due process guarantees. This is the moral bankruptcy we're dealing with. This is someone who looks at human beings locked in one of the most brutal detention facilities on Earth and says, good, they should die there. And this is the person making decisions about who gets to seek protection in the United States and who gets thrown onto a military plane in shackles. Now I want you to think about what Goldman exposed in that clip, because when he said if you deport anyone with an ongoing asylum application, you are violating the law, isn't that correct? And Noem pivoted to Joe Biden, left us with a broken asylum program. She wasn't disagreeing with the premise, she was refusing to engage with it. And that refusal is itself an admission, because if she could say no, we're following the law, we have legal authority for everything we're doing, she would have said it instantly. Instead, she filibustered, she deflected, she ran out the clock, and when Goldman reclaimed his time and stated for the record that yes, asylum is a lawful pathway, and if you have an open asylum case you are here lawfully, he was doing something crucial. He was creating a legislative record that establishes congressional intent, that establishes what the law actually is, so that when this inevitably ends up in court, there is no ambiguity about what Congress understands the statute to mean. And here's what makes this so urgent right now in this moment, because over 250 people have been arrested in immigration raids in Charlotte since the weekend, and among those arrested are numerous illegal aliens with extensive immigration and criminal histories, including domestic violence, assault, breaking and entering. But notice how they always lead with that narrative. They always talk about the criminals, the gang members, because data indicated non-criminal ICE arrests had jumped more than 800% since April, and only 30% of those in detention had criminal convictions, with 27% having pending criminal charges, and only 8.5% of those with criminal records were for violent offenses. So the vast majority of people being swept up in these raids are not dangerous criminals. They're workers, they're parents, they're students. They're people with pending asylum claims who are here legally, and they're being arrested at immigration court, where they attend their legally mandated hearings, which is exactly the bait-and-switch trap that Goldman and his colleagues are trying to stop. You want to know what's happening in cities across America right now, because fearing an encounter with ICE, many migrants retreated into isolation, and local businesses felt the blow, as workers stayed home and classroom seats sat empty, as immigrant parents dared not drive their kids to school. More than 30,000 students, about 20% of district enrollment, were absent from Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools the day after raids began there. 20% of students too afraid to go to school, because federal agents in unmarked vehicles are conducting military-style operations in residential neighborhoods, and you're going to tell me this is about public safety. You're going to tell me this is about removing dangerous criminals, when children are hiding in their homes terrified that their parents will be taken. And let's be absolutely clear about the racial dimensions of what's happening here, because this has never been about vetting, this has never been about security and safety, it's about cruelty, and his mass deportation agenda is all to lead to making America white again. And when Trump specifically targets Somali immigrants, saying they should go back to where they came from, and then launches operations in Minneapolis where U.S. citizens have been arrested or questioned by federal agents during these raids, we are watching ethnic targeting, we are watching racial profiling, we are watching the kind of indiscriminate roundups based on national origin and appearance that we said never again to, after the internment of Japanese Americans. But here we are, and the Secretary of Homeland Security won't even admit that deporting people with active asylum cases violates the law. This is why Goldman's questioning matters so much, because he's not just asking about one deportation or one policy. He's asking about the foundational question of whether this administration believes it's bound by law at all, and when Noem says, no, she did not defy the court's order, and criticized activist judges and radical decisions after the Justice Department already admitted that she decided detainees under the Alien Enemies Act, who were removed from the United States before the court's order could be transferred to El Salvador. Despite the judge explicitly ordering the planes turned around, we're seeing the playbook of authoritarian governance where the executive simply decides which court orders to obey and which to ignore based on political expediency. And you need to understand the implications here, because if the executive can ignore court orders on immigration, what's to stop them from ignoring court orders on anything else? If Congress can't get a cabinet secretary to answer a simple question about whether she's following the law, what does congressional oversight even mean? And if asylum, which is codified in federal statute, which is enshrined in international treaties, which represents one of the most fundamental humanitarian protections in modern law, can be swept away with an executive order and some filibustering before Congress, then what protection is actually safe? What right actually matters? Let me tell you what's happening right now while we're having this conversation, because the number of people who were granted voluntary departure while detained jumped more than fivefold to more than 16,000 in the first 8 months of 2025, compared with the same period a year earlier. And that number does not include those who gave up on their cases and were ordered deported, and some immigrants told they could face months or years of detention as their case moved through the backlogged immigration courts, already had agreed to leave the country. They're using detention conditions so horrific that people with legitimate asylum claims are giving up their cases just to get out. They're manufacturing voluntary departures through coercion and calling it enforcement. And this is precisely what happens when you strip away due process protections, when you turn asylum into an obstacle course designed to fail people rather than a genuine opportunity for protection. Goldman knows this, which is why he keeps fighting, which is why he introduced the Immigration Court Due Process Protection Act legislation that would prohibit DHS officers or agents from arresting or detaining an individual that is physically present at an immigration court facility for the purpose of attending a hearing, except pursuant to a judicial warrant, because he understands that when you turn courthouses into hunting grounds, you destroy the entire premise of a legal system based on due process. People stop showing up for their hearings not because they're criminals or fugitives, but because they're terrified of being arrested for following the law, and then you create the exact chaos and lack of accountability that the administration turns around and uses as justification for even more draconian measures. This is the authoritarian spiral. This is how democracies collapse, not with a sudden coup, but with the slow, methodical erosion of institutional constraints, with cabinet officials who won't answer questions, with courts whose orders are ignored, with laws that are openly flouted and then justified with appeals to emergency and crisis. And the previous administration's failures and Noem's performance in that hearing is a textbook example of how it works, because she knows she can't defend the legality of what she's doing. She knows Goldman has her cornered on the law, so instead she pivots to emotion and grievance. Joe Biden left us with a broken system. The asylum program was abused. They were allowing people to invade our country, and suddenly we're no longer talking about whether deportations are legal. We're talking about border security. We're talking about crisis. We're talking about anything except the actual question, which is, are you following the law? And I want to emphasize something crucial here, because there are people who will hear this exchange and think, well, Maybe the asylum system was broken. Maybe it needed reform, and you know what? That's a legitimate policy conversation. We can have debates about how asylum adjudication should work, about what resources the system needs, about how to process claims more efficiently. But here's what we cannot debate. Here's what is not a legitimate policy position. You cannot deport people with pending asylum applications. That is illegal. Full stop. The solution to a backlogged system is not to deport everyone in the backlog. The solution is to adequately fund immigration courts, to hire more judges, to provide counsel, to streamline the process while maintaining due process protections. But that's not what this administration wants, because the cruelty is the point. The chaos is the point. The goal is not a functioning asylum system. The goal is the elimination of asylum as a practical option for anyone seeking protection in the United States. And when Goldman says, "I'm proud to lead the introduction of the Immigration Due Process Protection Act," to put guardrails on the Trump administration's reckless tactics at federal immigration courts, he's articulating the fundamental progressive position here, which is that immigration enforcement must occur within the bounds of law, that due process is not a suggestion or a nicety, but a constitutional requirement that applies to everyone on U.S. soil, regardless of immigration status, and that when an administration demonstrates through its actions that it will not voluntarily comply with those constraints, Congress must step in and legislate explicit protections. But here's the tragedy. Here's what should fill us with rage and determination in equal measure, because that legislation will not pass the current Congress. The Republicans who control the House have made abundantly clear that they view any restriction on deportation authority as unacceptable, that they are fully aligned with this administration's vision of immigration enforcement, unbound by judicial or congressional oversight, and so Goldman can introduce the most righteous legislation, can give the most compelling floor speeches, can expose the administration's lawlessness in hearing after hearing, and it won't matter in terms of immediate legal change. What it does do is create a record. It establishes where people stood. It forces Republicans to vote against due process protections and own that vote, and it gives hope and validation to the millions of immigrants and their allies who are watching this unfold and wondering if anyone in power is paying attention, if anyone with a platform is willing to fight. And fight he is, because Goldman himself demanded to see the badge of one agent, who then unzipped his sweatshirt to reveal a golden emblem when he encountered the masked federal agents who lined the halls waiting for their targets at 26 Federal Plaza. And that physical confrontation, that willingness to put his body in the space where enforcement is happening and demand accountability in real time, is what moral leadership looks like in this moment. It's not enough to give speeches and introduce bills. You have to show up. You have to bear witness. You have to make it impossible for this to happen in the shadows, because that's what they want. That's always what they want. They want this to happen quietly in detention facilities that Congress can't access, in early morning raids before anyone is awake, in expedited removal proceedings that bypass immigration court entirely, and when someone like Goldman shows up with cameras and congressional authority and starts asking questions, starts demanding warrants, starts creating a public record of what's happening, that's when the whole machinery of state power mobilizes to shut it down, to call him an obstructionist, to accuse him of supporting criminals and gang members, to flood the zone with propaganda about how many arrests they made, how many criminal aliens they removed. And notice how Noem did exactly that in the clip. Notice how she immediately tried to shift the conversation to the previous administration's failures, as if the question of whether current deportations are legal somehow depends on how many asylum applications were pending when they took office. That's not how law works. That's not how constitutional government works. And Goldman knew that, which is why he kept cutting her off, which is why he reclaimed his time, which is why he stated explicitly for the record what the law is, because he knew she would try to run out the clock. He knew she would filibuster, and he wasn't going to let her. Now here's what we need to understand about the stakes of this moment, because after an Afghan national was charged for shooting 2 National Guard members, the administration halted processing green card and citizenship applications from nationals of 9 countries and ordered retroactive reviews of already approved applications, and USCIS stopped processing many immigration applications entirely, including for asylum, so they're using a single incident committed by someone who was actually granted asylum during the Trump administration to justify shutting down legal immigration processing for entire nationalities and reviewing years' worth of already approved applications. This is collective punishment. This is the textbook definition of discriminatory enforcement, and it's precisely the kind of thing that leads inexorably toward larger atrocities. When you establish the principle that one person's crime justifies restrictions on an entire ethnic or national group, you've opened the door to pogroms. And I'm not being hyperbolic. I'm not engaging in alarmism. I'm reading the clear trajectory of history because this is how it always starts. It starts with the dehumanization of a targeted population. It continues with the erosion of legal protections. It escalates with increasingly public and aggressive enforcement operations. And it culminates in mass atrocities that everyone afterward says they never saw coming, except people did see it coming. People like Goldman are seeing it right now in real time and sounding the alarm. And the question is whether enough of us will listen, whether enough of us will act, whether we'll look back on this clip of a congressman desperately trying to get a cabinet secretary to admit that she's violating the law and recognize it as the warning it was meant to be. This is the fight of our time. This is the moral test of this generation, and it's happening in immigration courts and congressional hearing rooms and detention centers across America, and every single one of us has a choice about what side we're on, about whether we're going to demand that our government follow the law, or whether we're going to accept the normalization of lawlessness, as long as it's directed at people who've been successfully dehumanized as illegal, as alien, as other. And Goldman is showing us what it looks like to choose resistance, to choose accountability, to choose the law over expediency. And that clip right there is a model for what every single member of Congress should be doing in every single hearing where administration officials try to evade their obligation to answer for their actions.